So last time we talked about how the method of evangelism can sometimes get in the way of the message of evangelism. And I also talked about how someone's method made it possible for me to hear the message for the very first time. So there I was. I didn't really have a church background, so I had created my own opinion about who God was. And then through this friend, and because of his influence, because of that relationship, I ultimately changed my mind. I had one thing in my mind for a long time, and then I noticed something, I heard something, and I got influenced. And the next thing you knew, I believed something completely different than I did before. If you've thought about it, when was the last time that you changed your mind about something? And I mean, there's the everyday things that we change our mind about. Of course, like which brand of ketchup you prefer or which side you part your hair. But what I'm talking about are the big things. Those things that only change maybe once or twice in your life. Like your political party, or if you're a diehard fan of a certain team, becoming a diehard fan of a different team, or maybe your career direction. Maybe you've changed your mind on a person, someone that you thought you would never have time for, but now you understand them differently. Perhaps you've completely turned the corner on how you make financial decisions or view money altogether. You might have decided to completely move to a different part of the country or to a different country entirely. These sorts of changes are rare, but they do happen. They just don't typically happen easily. No one wakes up in the morning and completely alters the way that they think about themselves or the world. These things happen over time. It's a process. See, as for me, as an adult, the way I changed my view about God, the way I came to trust Christ, it was also a process. And there were people along the way who were kind enough to be patient enough with me to realize that I was on my own journey and they were there to walk alongside me. And if you came to faith as an adult, and there may be exceptions, but my guess is that it was a process for you too. And different people, or maybe the same people, tracked with you throughout that process. Everybody's journey to faith is different, and two men, Doug Schopp and Don Everts, wrote a book called I Once Was Lost that gives us some great insights about people's journeys to faith. They call this journey the 5 thresholds, and these thresholds or benchmarks offer a helpful way to think about evangelism. In the book, they outline 5 thresholds that most people cross on their journey to following Jesus. Now, some people don't follow these 5 exactly, and there may be more than 5 of these thresholds for some people, but in general, there are 5 that we have noticed that most people go through. We've put together a summary of the 5 thresholds in a little animation, so check it out.
At some level, all of us who have placed our faith in Jesus desire to share about him with others. And why wouldn't we? It's great news. But the word we use for this, evangelism, has a lot of baggage that comes with it. Why is that? Maybe it's because it never seems to go that well. Or we've seen it done so poorly by others and we've thought to ourselves, no way I'm doing that. But instead of just beating ourselves up, maybe we need to give ourselves permission to look at evangelism differently. If we take a step back and take a fresh look at the whole process, not from our perspective, but from the perspective of other people, we will see that traditional evangelism assumes a lot about the evangelizee. You know what? That's not even a real word. Let's just call him Dan. After all, he is a person, not a project. Now, traditional evangelism assumes a lot about Dan. We assume he's at a place in his life where he's open, he's interested, and he's just sitting around waiting on someone to come along with the perfect answers to his most pressing questions. So when it comes to evangelism, we're typically taught to make sure we're prepared with a bunch of correct answers to any of Dan's potential questions. We just need to remember that sometimes people are looking for more than just information. And with that in mind, what we'd like you to pay attention to is where people actually are on their journey to faith. You see, what we've learned is that there are many thresholds a person goes through before seeking answers to their questions about God. we have come across a helpful resource that identifies 5 thresholds that people go through on their path to faith in Jesus, 3 of which begin way before the place modern evangelism typically starts. Each person on their journey to faith in Jesus is unique. With that being said, we have noticed some common trends when it comes to people's journey to faith. So, let's go back to Dan. Let's say Dan is your neighbor. He's married with 2 kids, he works at an accounting firm downtown, and he's pretty disinterested in God stuff. You know this, of course, because after you invited him to church a couple months ago, he started pretending to get phone calls every time he saw you in the driveway. At this point, he doesn't even have questions. Dan just needs to be able to trust a Christian. A recent study in the book Unchristian showed that 97% of 16 to 29-year-olds have a neutral or bad impression of evangelical Christians. That isn't something that we can ignore. So, what's the best thing we can do for Dan at this point, given everything we know about his journey? We can earn his trust. Don't worry about the answers yet. Don't have an agenda. Just ask questions about his family. Take an interest in him. Just listen. So maybe the win for you is that you may be the first Christian that someone has ever trusted. And that's a big deal. You've helped them take the first step on their journey. Once Dan gets to the place where he trusts you, it's only natural that he would cross through the second threshold, which is becoming curious about your faith. Maybe Dan starts to ask some questions. Celebrate that. Well, I mean to yourself, of course. The best thing you can do for Dan at this point in the journey is to help provoke his curiosity. And don't worry, you don't have to have all the answers. I don't know is fine. It actually lets Dan know that you have some of the same questions he does. Side note, Jesus was asked around 183 questions in the New Testament. How many times did he give explicit answers? Only 3. But how many questions did he ask in return? 307. Threshold 2 is where your main role is to provoke their curiosity by asking good questions. Questions that show that you're genuinely curious about them, and questions to help them discover what it is they really want to know. A lot of times, Dan's curiosity will lead them to the next threshold, which is being open to change. This might actually be the hardest threshold for most people. Scratch that, it is. Change is difficult for all of us. Dan may trust you and he may be really curious, but he just isn't open to change yet. And that's okay. The best thing you can do here is to be patient. Don't give up on Dan if he's not fitting into your timeline. Trying to force the issue might actually do more harm than good at this point. Threshold 3 can be difficult, but hang in there because our patience makes it easier for someone to take the next step. If and when Dan becomes open to change, this openness will lead him to the 4th threshold, which we call seeking after God. This is where evangelism approaches assume most people start. Do you see what opportunities we'd miss if we just started out here with Dan? But because he's gone at his own pace, now Dan is becoming aware that there are some implications to following Jesus. And because of that, he may ask more questions. He may still have doubts about all of it. He may still try to cling to the life that he's used to. The best thing you and I can do for Dan at this point is let him know that he is not alone. You've been there. You have faith and you have doubts. And just a side note, you know doubt is okay, right? Genuine faith includes doubt. Being real about your journey makes faith attractive to other people. The 5th and last threshold in Dan's journey to faith is where he is ready to enter into a relationship with God. He's learned what he needs about how Jesus has made a way for him to know God, and he's ready to put his trust in him. Okay, those were the 5 thresholds, and we know that's a lot of information, but we think this is important for you to know. We believe that you are much more important than any curriculum or video we could give you. We seem to put this pressure on ourselves to be the one with all the answers. The tendency is to want to hurry people along in the process, but it's more important that you journey with someone rather than try to take the journey for them. So, we hope you'll use these 5 thresholds as a guide to help you identify and respond based on where other people are on their journey towards God.
Okay, so those are the 5 thresholds. Each one of those thresholds is assuming that you are in a genuine relationship with the person. You're not targeting them or stalking them. That's a different problem altogether. You just genuinely care for them with no agenda. The 5 thresholds are just something to be aware of so that when the opportunity surrounding faith comes up, you know the best way to engage. The first 2 thresholds we talked somewhat about last week. So much of evangelism is how we live our lives and then simply being ready to answer questions others may have. With threshold 1, trusting a Christian, people are simply asking, "Can I trust you?" And you should be looking to prove that they can. So be nice, reach out, find something in common. Just look to engage in normal, everyday, friendly conversation. Now, as we said last time, every interaction that you have with someone is a demonstration about what you believe to be true. So this threshold is the easiest to recognize, but maybe the most difficult to engage with. It's more about being trustworthy yourself and earning the right to have a relationship with this person. It may be better to ask the question, am I making it harder or easier on the next Christian that is going to come along, and try to influence this person towards Christ? For threshold 2, becoming curious, look to be curious back. Ask questions that dig deeper and learn where their curiosity comes from. Questions like, what makes you ask that? Or how long have you wondered about that are good ones to start with. And when the questions they're asking need an answer, make sure your answers are short and sweet. Be helpful, but not overwhelming. We talked about this last week, but be ready to give an answer for the hope that you have, but just keep the answer simple for now. If they have a small cup of curiosity, don't answer with a fire hose of information. Remember, you're on their schedule. For the next threshold, being open to change, the right posture is patience and more patience. There's no hurry, and it's not uncommon for people to spend months or even years at this threshold. At this point, they may be a little more open to taking advice. So as a friend, offer advice just as you would with any other friend. Help them take the next steps to grow and to learn one step at a time at their pace. At the next threshold, seeking after God, general questions about their lives give way to serious questions about faith. You should be ready for these questions. As Peter says, be ready to give a reason for the hope that you have. You don't have to know all the answers. No one does. And they can trust you now, but what they're wondering is if they can really trust Jesus. All that they read and understand about him, does it add up? The most important thing you can do is be there for them. Let them know that they are not alone. Be real about your journey. It's very possible that they'll need to be reminded that even faith at its best will include doubts. So be honest about your doubts too. People at this stage of their journey may have been here before, expressed doubts, and then were totally run off. If they can hear from a Christian that faith can still include doubt, it can give them the courage to be ready to follow Christ. At some point, when a person is around threshold 4 or 5, ready to make a decision to follow Christ, they need to know clearly what it is that they are believing in, and they need to take a step. If someone has asked you what it means to believe in Jesus or what the gospel is, would you know where to start? Our hope is that you'll have a good enough relationship with this person so that you can share your faith casually. Likely, the right thing to say in that moment will come to you, but a basic structure could help. First of all, there are lots of ways to share the message of Christ. You can look online, or your church probably has resources. You can find hundreds of examples of what it looks like to share the gospel in a clear way. Given what somebody already knows, it may be as simple as reminding them that Jesus Christ died for their sins and rose from the dead. It kind of depends on where the person is and what they need to know. Those are just some of the tips surrounding each of the 5 thresholds, and it's important to remember that these thresholds are descriptive, not prescriptive. It's not always obvious where someone is on their journey, and who's to say that they don't bounce around a little among some of the thresholds. But the thresholds are a helpful way to talk about how most people journey toward faith. Our part in the process is to love people well. It's to build trust, ask great questions, be patient, and support them. We can't coerce anyone into the faith, but we can be a helpful companion on their journey. To close us out, here's something to remember. With any decent investment, the biggest payoff comes only after time. And sometimes it's a lot of time. With people, that time spent together is sometimes just social time. Sometimes it's more intentional. Sometimes it's painful. Sometimes it's joyful, but it's just time. Spending time getting to know people and really caring about them is how we invest in them. And like any relationship, this is not a one-way street. These are not projects, they're relationships. They'll grow you and shape you too. So look to invest in other people. Invest your time, your curiosity, your willingness to walk with them wherever they are in their faith journey. And who knows, by just being willing to meet people where they are, God may be preparing you right now to help someone take a next step in their faith.